Reflections on Utopia and Revolution by Maximilien Rubel from the Socialist Humanism Compendium by Erich Fromm. It begins with a description of Maximilien Rubel's work, or a summary of who Maximilien Rubel is. And it looks like there's a lot of French in here. Oh, Jesus Christ. Maximilien Rubel is Master of Research at the French National Center of Scientific Research and has written widely on Marx and Marxism. Born in Czernowitz, Austria-Hungary in 1905, he became a naturalized French citizen in 1936 and holds a license in law and a Doctor of Letters. Now time for the essay. Two ideas of great importance are to be found at the very core of socialist thinking: utopia and revolution, yet they are seldom examined in their reciprocal relations. It is as if revolution were held to imply the rejection or exclusion of utopia, and utopia to imply the banishment or denial of revolution. Such appears to be, summarily described, the general approach of 19th century socialist thinkers. In the 20th century, up to the First World War, the debate, although restricted to the ideological disputes cropping up periodically between Marxists and non-Marxists, or Marxists and anarchists, were somewhat livelier. But since then there is only silence, as if the turmoil of contemporary history had muted all voices daring to urge a resumption of the debate. Back to the sources. Marxism is not the sum total of all socialist ideology, nor does Marxism embody all socialist thought. Marxism's ethics and theories go back to the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England during the last third of the 18th century. From the very start, socialism appears with all the characteristics of a new gospel, a message of worldly liberation and salvation. However visionary they may have seemed to others, the early socialists or communists of the industrial age did not conceive their ideals as being inconsistent with the practical means of carrying them into effect. For William Godwin, reason is the means to achieve the desired social transformation, and Gracchus Babeuf, violence, i.e. unreason, is the means. At first declared to be a legal movement, revolution, due to the closing of the Pantheon Club, became the business of a, quote, secret directory, end quote, empowered to act, quote, by and for the people, end quote. Babeuf's idea is to seize power in order to, quote, restore it to the people, end quote. But there are obstacles to be overcome. Called to the ballot boxes, the masses were quite capable of restoring tyranny. Prior to exercising sovereignty, the masses had to be taught their lesson. Irresistibly, once started on the slope of impatience and, quote, provisional authority, the Babeauvists transformed social revolution into organized war, with all the rules of the game: hierarchy, discipline, obedience, commandments, specialization, etc. It is revolution managed from above, by a general staff or a committee of experts. But until it is time for the masses to act by themselves, it is revolution managed from above by a general staff or a committee of experts, until it is time for the masses to act by themselves once the enemy has been defeated and power conquered. This ambiguity of Babovism is to be found also in Auguste Blanqui and his followers. Honesty and good intentions are tokens of devotion offered the people, a people still ignorant, reduced to mere inert matter, or more exactly to a main striking force on the battlefield. The essence of Babovism is outer directed organized violence. Babovism's humanism is in the intention, the aim, the utopia. Babovism's humanism is not to be found in the means, unless one considers vengeful acts perpetrated by the rebellious masses to be manifestations of their will to achieve freedom. In this case, it would be the purpose of violence to, quote, humanize, end quote, violence, since it aims at establishing a society devoid of violence. The danger and weakness of such a conception reside in the impossibility of foreseeing and appraising, choosing and evaluating actions in a humanist perspective. The so-called utopian socialism goes back to a tradition of humanist rationalism prior to the French Revolution. With Saint-Simon, spiritual heir of the encyclopedists, political power plays only an accessory part. The, quote, new Christianity is the ethical basis of a power which is not political but administrative, managerial. The essence of this socio-economic Christianity is a science of production. Politics is replaced by industrial organization for human well-being and security, whose only objective is, in the words of Saint-Simon, on his deathbed, quote, to assure to all men the greatest freedom in developing their faculties, end quote. The utopians intend to reform society in the name of reason and science. In the view of Robert Owen, cooperation is the key to solving social problems. Owen has none of Charles Fourier's passion. Owen has no imagination. Owen's doctrine amounts to a few elementary ideas, the basic idea being that man is the product of man's environment. Still, the pioneer of cooperative socialism was always ready to advocate spontaneous effort, distrust, and even hostility towards the powerful, the rich, the ruling classes. If socialism means cooperation, then Owen is the first of the contemporary socialists. And if, in the last analysis of Marx's socialism, is simply a system or method of cooperative production, then Marx is Owen's disciple. Order break. The crickets are really loud tonight, and there's a lot of animal noises outside, so I had to close the window because I felt like it would interfere with the beauty of my voice being heard. So it's hot in here. Karl Marx. Marx did not abolish utopia. On the contrary, Marx rejuvenated utopia and enlarged utopia's scope. With Marx, utopia becomes one single movement in two stages: revolution, creation. Before Marx, the utopians thought and imagined creation independently from the very men who were supposed to build the new city. Man was Marx's first and foremost concern. Quote, "We know that for the newfangled forces of society to work well, they only need to be mastered by newfangled men, and such are the working men. End quote. Speech at the anniversary of the People's Paper, April 14th, 1856, Marx. Initially Fourier and Owen's disciple, soon deeply involved in political struggle, Marx was never to break the spiritual bonds that linked him to utopian socialism. It suffices to read on that score a statement which he prepared 2 years before his death for the Russian populace who sought his opinions about the chances and perspectives of the peasants' communes in the context of the development of capitalism in Russia. Not once, during that lengthy and arduous reflection, does Marx dwell upon the political questions properly speaking, such as class structures or party organization. All his thought bears upon the original nature of the archaic institution of the rural commune, and the rural commune's importance as a, quote, regeneratory element in the Russian society, an element of superiority over the countries enslaved by capitalist regimes, end quote. In that apologia for a quote, localized microcosm, end quote, as Marx calls the Russian commune, it is easy to see a last tribute which he pays to Robert Owen, pioneer of cooperative and communal socialism. Like his utopian predecessor, Marx puts all his confidence in the creative spontaneity of those who produce the wealth of nations without enjoying the wealth of nations themselves. Marx bestows upon the primitive commune the virtues of a social microcosm. One may recognize in this idealizing of an as yet ill-known institution a projection into the future of a wish image. Yet it is no accident that Marx felt a sympathy for Owen's Utopia. The cooperative commune which Marx imagined meets the equation we mentioned earlier, that of the opposition between the Jacobin political concept and the one we shall now call, for the sake of clarity, the communalist concept of the workers' movement. In the first, initiative of action and consciousness, of purpose are conferred on political avant-gardes heading large and easily maneuverable masses. In the second, the small size of action groups makes it possible to do away with lasting and hence, quote, professional leaders, and all political elites are deemed superfluous. Here, delegating power does not mean the relinquishment of a right, but the conferring of a temporary and imperative mandate for a strictly circumscribed task. In a sense, Marx is the most utopian of the utopians, caring little about the city to be, bending his mind on destroying the existing order. He elevates revolution to the level of an absolute requirement. It is the mechanics of this imaginary and imaginative revolution that partake of utopia. It supposes men thoroughly conscious of their, quote, gilded miseries, end quote. Men capable of thinking the entire gamut of social and socialist reality. In fact, Marx lays down an economic law of pauperization which is more difficult to grasp than plain and naked one. Marx grafts the utopia to be onto the actual daily struggle. He grafts the utopia to be onto the actual daily struggle and formulates a dialectical clue to the proletarian revolution. Let the workers will and make their revolution, and they shall get socialism in the bargain. In other words, for the workers to become conscious of their alienation, in the deepest meaning Marx ascribes to this Hegelian term, is eo ipso, to become capable of both destroying capitalism and building utopia, a classless, stateless, moneyless society. Thus, Marx's concept contains an odd paradox. It is at the culminating point of their destitution that the workers are presumed to become conscious of the dire necessity of advancing toward a social rebirth through a total revolution. A strange, quote, materialism indeed, which envisages such a metamorphosis of the slave who has been turned into a mere cog of a profit-making industrial machine. According to Marx, quote, communist consciousness, end quote, is supposed to, quote, emanate from the dispossessed masses, not at all from the intellectual elite, the German ideology. Bourgeois intellectuals cannot become communists prior to reaching the level of revolutionary consciousness which is that of the enslaved workers. Therein lies the paradox of the workers' movement. Yet Marx makes the distinction between socialist consciousness and socialist science. Socialist science is both possible and necessary in relation with the double-edged concrete movement of the proletariat, class consciousness, and political action. In appointing their own political spokesman, the workers voice their will to upset the existing order from within, or depending on circumstances from outside the established institutions. Quote, the proletariat constitutes itself into a class and consequently into a political party, end quote. States the Communist Manifesto, showing thereby that instead of joining political parties outside of the workers' own ranks, the workers awake spontaneously and creatively to the consciousness of their selfhood. Whereas interest and profit cement into a unit the bourgeois class, the proletariat's cohesion as a class is hammered out in the daily struggle for bread and the consciousness of pursuing a revolutionary goal. What Marx and before him in 1843, Flora Tristan, thus formulated in one single proposition, namely that, quote, the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class itself, end quote, remains the implicit postulate of all genuine socialist thought. Unions, parties, councils, and other forms of labor organizations are true to their aims only if they are the conscious and spontaneous creation of the workers themselves. As a class whose very being takes on the form of organized struggle, the workers must not commit their initiative to the hands of a corporate elite that claims to prescribe and guide their social and political action. No other meaning can be ascribed to the formula which Marx and Engels repeated again and again as they censored the bourgeois intelligentsia for professing to educate the working class politically. No doubt, intellectuals do play a part in the workers' movement, but the part intellectuals play is adequate and effectual only inasmuch as intellectuals bring into the movement, quote, elements of culture, end quote, and not ready-made theories, philosophies, esoteric doctrines concerning the ends and means of history, a dialectic of revolutionary action, etc. True, As a man of action and a party, quote, leader, Marx did not always himself conform strictly to the principle of workers' self-emancipation, but at least both he and Engels recognized the fact and found fault with themselves each time they searched their souls. Marxism judged by Marx. The real problem is not the opposition, Utopia, Marxism, Marxism, reformism, Marxism, revisionism, but Jacobinism, self-emancipation. The point in question is whether, at the same time as they entrust to chosen and or elected bodies the representation and defense of their interests, social classes and men as such can retain the autonomy of their consciousness and actions. There is a dangerous ambiguity looming here. Is a social class able to have one consciousness, one will, one action? In other words, is it possible for a social class to think, will, act, accept through the instrumentality of, quote, democratically elected mandatories appointed to represent, i.e., to voice the will and thought of a community? In that sense, is not the group's formal or tacit approval regarding their delegates' doings and decisions the sole evidence there is to the congruency of their will with his comportment? But if, thus formulated, the question carries its own answer, the answer does not exhaust the whole question. Indeed, a further question arises which demands a rejoinder. What are the most efficient conditions in which a delegation of mandates would result in representing the real interest of those concerned? Socialist thinking prior to Marx was very much preoccupied with this question. The answer consisted in describing and defending a, quote, ideal society. Marx inherited and enriched this legacy. His challenge is aimed not at the fundamentals, but at some of the aberrant aspects of the so-called utopian socialism. Producers' communes, cooperative enterprise, oneness of work and culture, in short, Utopia's stateless and moneyless city, represents in Marx's view the resurrection, alongside modern technology, of the archaic rural commune and the cradle of primitive communism. The historical experience of the last 60 years carries a clear, unequivocal lesson. In both its reformist and revolutionary forms, the Jacobin conception of the labor movement has met with failure. When Lenin broke the ties he had kept until the First World War with Kautsky's ideas, he proclaimed the ineffectiveness of the labor movement in the industrial developed countries whose proletariat had been, quote, betrayed by an aristocracy which issued from the proletariat's own ranks. On the other hand, Lenin argued, the material and moral conditions for a revolutionary movement did exist in an industrially underdeveloped and mainly rural country such as Tsarist Russia. It was Tsarist Russia, according to the so-called theory of, quote, permanent revolution, then common to Trotsky and Lenin, that the socialist revolution could be set in motion, if not carried through. Actually, in theory and practice, Lenin and his party were an elite of bourgeois radical intellectuals artificially grafted onto a stirring social mass whose genuine revolutionary aspirations were readily manipulated by an apparatus of professional revolutionists. The results were soon to be felt. After winning the confidence of the spontaneously formed Soviets, who opposed the Kerensky government, the Bolshevik Party succeeded in establishing itself as a state power. Just as in the countries of capitalist tradition, a political aristocracy conscious of that political aristocracy's interests and objectives had taken the place of the, quote, social microcosm, end quote, which, according to Marx's theory and Utopia, surges spontaneously from the soil of every society in a state of historical evolution and transformation. Marx may have overestimated the political element in the workers' movement, but he never supposed that the working class had to abandon itself to the dialectical wisdom of a party or an elite of political experts. For Marx, the utopia of the revolution is an ethic of revolutionary behavior. The workers' destitution is the central motivation of the revolutionary act, as well as the creative forces of the new social order. As the direct subject of this revolutionary transformation, the worker is also this revolutionary transformation's object, since the worker abolishes himself as a wage earner. Conclusion. Utopia and revolution are the two historical coordinates of the socialist movement. That is to say, in order to materialize, the socialist movement must regard itself as both utopia and revolution. It means also that to become a socialist, one must be at the same time a utopian and a revolutionary. One must will and desire revolution and utopia, will the abolition of our society, and desire the creation of the new city. The ethic of revolution and utopia is that of the ethic of revolution and utopia is an ethic of a socialist humanism. Socialism is a historical necessity only inasmuch as socialism is thought and willed as an ethical necessity. That is what Marx had in mind when he offered the following dilemma. The proletariat is either revolutionary or the proletariat is nothing. To restore its full meaning to the concept of socialist ethics, let us add that socialism is either consciousness of utopia or socialism is nothing. Translated by J. Malaquais, if I'm pronouncing that French name right. Thanks for listening.